Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on where you're listening from. My name is Kasey Long. My co host today is Wyatt Southerland, and we are part of this wonderful company that we're starting up called Coalescence Publishing. Now, what that is it's this company that we built with the image of basically giving every writer the tools they need to succeed. We believe that if given the proper support system, everyone can be a writer or a successful author if they put their mind to it. Anyone can. And we started this company up to not only help educate new authors, existing authors, but we want to support the literature world because it's given us so much. You know, in our darkest times, we read stories and it gives us this escape to go and just find this new world where the problems of our society does not exist. And on this podcast, we're going to be talking a little bit about, well, I say a little bit, we're actually going to go pretty deep into conversations about everything to do with literature. We're going to be hosting authors here. We're going to talk about genres, what the difference is between fiction and nonfiction, certain tropes that we're seeing in modern writing, etc., etc. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll get this show on the road?
Hello, my name is Wyatt Southerland. I am a full time writer for Coalescence Publishing. And today we are going to be talking about genre. And this is going to be the first episode in a three-part series or more, depending on how our discussions go, um, where we talk about everything to do with genre, what it is, our favorite genres, and how we as writers plan on innovating on old genres, maybe even trying our hand at creating new genres. But we're obviously talking non scholarly here. This is just kind of our opinions. If you disagree, feel free to voice those disagreements in the comments below. Um, And to get right on into it, today we are going to be talking about what is genre um, to us specifically, but also maybe voicing some of your own thoughts as well.
Thanks for that, Wyatt. So, when we talk about genre, before we go into this big, long discussion about it, what is it? How do we define genre? I think before we start talking, we need to know what it is.
Right. So, Merriam Webster defines genre as a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. Um, Basically, what that means is that it's any kind of art, any expression of art that shares similarities with how others have expressed themselves. So, a genre of music could be romantic music, or a genre of um, literature could be is fantasy, a genre of movies, and so on and so forth. If they share similarities, then they're likely in the same genre. But what is genre really? I think is a good question to ask, and that kind of gets us to ask, what do we use genre for, and what does it mean for writers? But also, what does it mean for readers? Because those two groups don't necessarily experience genre in the same way. So, um, do you have any thoughts on that?
Of course. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind when we talk about genre is, why does it exist? Why do we classify things? Because that's what genre is. You are taking something and you are classifying it. So we have to figure out, why do we do that? And the first thing that comes to my mind is distinguishment. You know, let's say I'm a reader and I like horror movie. Well, I am a reader and I do like horror. Um, but I like certain types of horror. I like Lovecraftian horror, cosmic horror, sci-fi horror. But I don't really like romantic horror. I know. Sorry if that offends anyone. You can like whatever you like. But going back to the question, distinguishment is the first thing that comes to my mind. That is probably one of the number one things that genre is there for.
Right. Yeah, it definitely it helps us distinguish between tropes. It helps us establish communities, which we'll talk about in a minute. Um, for sure, yeah, it allows us to kind of categorize certain things, and that can have positive and negative um, repercussions to how we view art. And it has, in the modern age, been affected greatly by the kind of modern market, and the way our economy works has changed the way that we view art and genre. Um, but honestly, genre in and of itself is a natural development. In times, even in times past, there has been genre distinguishments, uh, and even ancient civilizations, ancient societies recognize the difference between one genre and the next, and they recognize the way that it allowed different authors to communicate different ideas through different motifs and tropes, and readers recognize the way that it allowed them to engage with different media. One good example of the way that uh, genre tropes have allowed readers or have has kind of defined reader experiences is through tropes and genre conventions. For instance, like if you are a member of the fantasy literature loving community, you likely know what an elf is. It can look and sound and feel many different ways, but there's only so many ways you can skin a cat. There's only so many elves that you can imagine, and they all just kind of, you get that feeling of an elf or a dragon.
I'm gonna interject here real quick, Wyatt. So when you say elf, that's such a foreign term to me. I don't really. Are we talking like Dobby from Harry Potter, or like Kelthos from World of Warcraft?
All of them, all of it, it's all
Oh,
elves. And it's all, and that is something that only readers in a certain community can say, because you've had so much experience and so much time with a certain genre, namely fantasy in this circumstance, that you can look at things that look, sound, and seem completely different, and see an elf or a dragon, like you look at Game of Thrones, how dragons look in that, and then you look at How to Train Your Dragon, but it's all dragons, and you kind of know that. And um writers can take advantage of this in a lot of different ways by leaning on these conventions, finding the ways that the things that they like about a certain convention, but not having to stick to that as much. And we'll probably talk about that in a moment. But readers can take advantage of genre distinctions like that to form community. And that's an important thing about art, is that it's expression of emotion, and its expression of its escapism, And all art is deeply personal in a lot of ways for both the writers and the readers.
Can I ask you a quick question about that statement?
What's that?
So when you say all art is personal, um, deviate a little bit off the railroads here. Let's say you have a an artist up in New York who's wanting to take advantage of the banana art thing. You know what I'm referencing?
I do not. I'm sorry.
This person got a banana and duct taped it to a canvas. I think it was a canvas. I'll have to go back and double check, but it was a banana with duct tape over it, and it sold for this insane amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
And there's people trying to recreate that. Um, Maybe the original artist, maybe it was personal for them, but is it personal? Is the art created by people who strictly want to monetize it and they don't truly care about their art? Is it still personal at that point?
Right. And that's important. As we're talking about what genre is, that's an important way to kind of segue into another aspect of genre, which is how has modern markets affected what
Mm.
genre means to us. And I think, for instance, you're talking about visual art.
Yes.
That
Yes.
that yes, that's deeply personal for the artists, and deeply personal for the people who experience it. You know, I think if someone experienced something, felt a certain way by looking at that, then it is art and it is valuable and it is important. And then, but the monetization aspect kind of makes things difficult. Um, with regards, well, for instance, with regards to literary art, genre has kind of been co opted by modern markets from its original form, which was simply distinguishing certain motifs and themes and tropes. Um, uh, Now it's kind of become co-opted by big publishing studios and stuff like that, um, in order to figure out what sells best, and kind of pigeonhole artists into creating what sells best because we run on that. And that is a negative way that genre has affected all artists, especially literary artists, and kind of forcing us to push our imaginations through certain shaped holes, that publishing studios and large publishing studios, um, and large just marketing schemes and stuff like that have kind of forced us to think about our art and our creativity.
And that's something that I'm really starting to notice um, here, especially in the past like 5 to 10 years. I'm noticing a lot more like young adult genre related works coming out onto the market because that's the big thing. There's a lot of romance novels and short stories going out because that's the thing. That is what's popular, and that is
Cinematic
more.
universes.
Well, not even that, but more importantly, at the bottom line of it, that is what matters to the big publishers is monetization. Your two biggest money makers is going to be romance and young adult. And there's going to be a few people that disagrees with that. Some people will say fantasy is. And I'm not going to sit here and say fantasy is not a moneymaker. It is.
Hmm.
Fantasy fantasy is always going to have a place on the market. But some of your more niche genres, like Lovecraft, for example, Lovecraft is a very niche genre when you look at the grand scheme of things.
Hmm.
But going back, since we're talking about how things develop and evolve over time, because I think we can talk about how the big publishing studios are monetizing everything and shaping the market. I think that we can say that for another episode. But going back to genre, we need to talk about the natural development of things, because writers and readers use genre for two separate things, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, Wyatt, what does, when we talk about natural development, what's the difference between writers and readers in that sense?
So definitely the difference between writers and readers is how we interact with the art. Kind of there's a to address some. This is something to address right here, which is what's the difference between a market and an audience. um, so
Oh man, that's a
so
whole other
yes.
topic.
Right. Well, it kind of is important to think about right here because
Mm-hmm.
you're what you're talking about with what's going to make money and stuff like that. That's a market, and a large market is young adults, and a large market is romance readers. That's a very appealing fantasy for a lot of people. Um, so that's a market. But if you're thinking about an audience, then things start to get a little bit more vague. And that is how readers, I think, that is how readers experience genre is vague and but somehow pervasive. It uh, kind of captures you. And so if we're talking about the natural development of genre, and well, we can go all the way back to the way the Greeks used literature. You had the difference between, say, a poet, an epic poet, using the gods and heroes to address a certain theme, like Homer. Uh, but then you also had the philosophers, like philosophical writers like Herodotus, who uh, wanted to educate and use the written word and even narrative in some cases, to educate society on a social level. So you've got this difference between individuals and heroism developing in literature from a very early point in history. What does a hero look like? What kind of values can an individual live by? What is exciting to think about, and with regards to the world around us and gods and the unseen? And then you have the philosophical, where you're addressing society and you're addressing the very tangible world. You've got even the distinction between um, romance literature and chivalric literature, where romance emphasizes the individual experience. So you've got Romeo and Juliet, emphasizing this individual experience of love, and then you've got chivalric literature, um, emphasizing the importance of social values revolving around love. And that is how readers and writers share a certain vagueness in the experience of genre, because what is a reader getting out of the experience of a book? Is it inherently escapist? But I don't feel like that's exactly the right word. Or is it philosophical? Are they drawing some sort of social knowledge about the world by reading this? Or are they feeling excited? Are they getting to know something about themselves? Are they learning something about individual people, through reading a work? And that can be fiction or nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. And since we're on this topic, one thing that comes to my mind is when we talk about genre, there's a lot of different types of genre out there. Sometimes people think two different genres have the exact same meaning to them. You know, earlier you were talking about romance and chivalric genre. I know Southern lingo here, but with generalized romance, that's just it. It's just a general romance genre, and chivalric romance is a subgenre of that. You know, where it's it's the knight in shining armor rescuing the princess, going on this mighty adventure through the woods of Kazawa, what have you. That's chivalric. We hear it a lot in like fairy tales. Disney has a lot of chivalric based romance. Like look at oh god.
Snow White.
Yes, Snow White. Look at
Snow
Snow
White.
White. What's the one and guys, ladies, please don't kill me for this. What's the Disney movie with Maleficent in it?
Sleeping Beauty.
Sleeping Beauty. Is it Sleeping Beauty?
Yep.
Huh. Well, anyways, that's another tale of because he fights the dragon form
Right.
of Maleficent. Okay, yeah. So that's another classic form of chivalric romance. And since we're on
Mhm.
this topic, another thing is I'm noticing a lot of people think like existential literature is the same thing as Lovecraftian genre.
Mhm.
And granted, Lovecraft has a lot of existential based literature in his works, but they are different.
Mhm.
With existential literature, you're talking about this person or the general protagonist who has to confront something that helps him or her determine their purpose in the world. And
Or
that
not. Just go completely insane.
precisely because that is the chaos of existentialism. And that's something I'm noticing that's becoming a little bit more prevalent is people are starting to combine genres, and I don't really understand.
Well, I
But
think I think I think it is generally a good thing, because it shows that people are no longer viewing themselves. People are starting to maybe question how to view themselves and in how they interact with art. Do they view themselves as a market, or do they view themselves as an audience, like we were talking about earlier? Um, like I said, readers, experienced readers, anyone who views a piece of art experiences genre vaguely and pervasively. So there is a lot of existentialism in Lovecraft's work and in Lovecraftian fiction. Um, and that is the point, sort of, is to see that genre is inherently descriptive rather than prescriptive. You know what I mean by that?
go ahead and explain it to me, just in case I have amnesia or something.
So what I mean by descriptive rather than prescriptive is that genre describes the kind of vague ways that that a certain trope or motif makes you feel, and the ways that you want to interact with it, rather than uh, something that you go into a piece of art to create. For instance, and this is kind of more on the writer's side of things, but uh, it's important for writers to understand that genre describes their work rather than prescribes their work. So rather than if you want to write a fantasy, you can use a lot of fantasy motifs, a lot of fantasy tropes. You can use these conventions, but you are not like by prescriptive. I kind of mean like the genre demands that you do this. Like if you're writing a
Ah,
fantasy, the
uh-huh.
genre demands that your main character be a chosen one. That's what prescriptive means. Um, but it's not if you write a excuse me, if you write a fantasy work that doesn't have a chosen one as a protagonist, but has elves and dragons and they're interacting with each other in certain ways, that's still a fantasy. Why is it still a fantasy? We don't know. It feels like fantasy. And so that's what descriptive means. It's kind of genre is applied to a work after it's written, not before it's written. You write and you write a story from what you want to create, and then others will decide how that makes them feel. And that's why genre is such a confusing thing when it's taken out of the context of a dictionary. It's not quite so simple as just a thing that shares these certain aspects. No, because it's a thing, a book can do a lot of things that doesn't really sound like fantasy. But when you read it, you're like, this is fantasy. This is a fantasy book.
Well, let me ask you the big question here, Wyatt. We've talked a lot about genre today, and I just got to know, is it more useful for writers or is it more useful for readers?
Uh it's useful for both in different ways. So for writers, you can like you have that kind of backlog of conventions that you can draw from and innovate on. But it also for writers, I mean, in the modern world, it helps with marketing. If you're we have to eat as writers, and so maybe
That's an
trying
assumption.
to well, um maybe playing into genre conventions for the sake of attracting a bigger market or a bigger audience can be a good idea for a writer to do, and that's important. Not necessarily the most important aspect of genre from my point of view, but it is important. But for readers, it is incredibly useful. And this is something that I really want to like maybe get into in a different episode. But for readers, beyond the marketing, genre is important for creating community. It's important for developing subcultures around these subgenres, like you're talking about, where the distinguishment allows you to express things and then figure out who else in the world wants to express that thing with you in a similar way. And that leads to validation, where readers and members of a community who love steampunk like that's a huge community in the cosplay, among cosplaying and stuff like that. It's a huge subculture, and that is so important for readers, um, to have that validation of a community. And you wouldn't have that if you didn't have genre conventions. You wouldn't have that if you didn't have the distinguishment between works of art.
I'm going to cut in here real quick, Wyatt. So, one thing I've noticed that genre does for readers, when we talk about validation, building a community up, and everything like that, we talk a lot about how they feel more comfortable about what they're reading. And I think that leads to normalizing of taboos. You know,
Hmm.
we, a few weeks ago, you and I had this conversation about how certain taboos are starting to become normalized while other taboos are starting to arise. So I think that's something that genre definitely has a play in when it comes to readers.
Hmm. For sure. And one good way that that happens is with regards to gender. So like for instance, you used to have very little female characters, and they were very there was a lot of stereotypes and tropes that were negative towards women, and men, honestly. It, but when you see in the modern day books and works, there's a broader range of male and female characters being created. They're not all fitting into this stereotype that's of the kind of heterosexual ideal anymore. And for instance, I was watching a video. I can't remember who it was by, but she was talking about how D&D um, is an incredibly attractive community for LGBTQ people. Apps that we're talking about this on Pride Week, um, uh,
Pride
but
Month.
Pride Month. Yes, apologies. Um, uh, but you have this gender of fantasy, this particular gender of fantasy of tabletop storytelling, that allows you to create an image, that allows you to bend the rules around how you feel, and create things that wouldn't be created uh, by anybody else. Um, that is what genre allows you to do. Like fantasy is a wonderful genre for, I would say, fantasy and science fiction, because I do draw a distinction between the two. Fantasy and science fiction are two of the best genres for exploring gender and sexuality, because either it's in the far future and you can like imagine how humankind has developed its ideas around these things, or it's in a completely different universe where you can create the rules that society uh, acknowledges how gender and sexuality play out.
So that's pretty interesting, Wyatt, and I think that's a topic we should revisit in a future episode. Um, we are at the end of our talking time, though, Wyatt. So, man, that was a good conversation. You know, I really love that we're just touching the top of the iceberg with genre. Um, to our listeners and even people who don't even listen, who's just walking by accidentally hearing this, thank you for listening to our first episode. Our next episode, we're going to be talking about our favorite genre. You know, it's going to be part of our series, and we're going to be talking about our favorite genre to read, to watch, and lastly, since Wyatt and I are both writers, we're going to be talking about our favorite genres to write. And man, that's going to be a really interesting series because I get to talk about my favorite genres. But, anyways, Wyatt, do you have anything else you want to say?
No, just tune in next time.
Yep, just tune in, follow us on Twitter. It's Coalescence P. That's our username. Just type in Coalescence Publishing and you'll be able to find us perfectly fine. We got a Facebook page and an Instagram if you want to follow us there too. We have some awesome stuff we post. If you're an author, keep on writing. If you're not an author, keep on writing. If you're a reader, keep on reading too. Until next time, everyone, thank you.